Okay, so it's difficult to talk about culture without talking about and acknowledging subcultures. So, a subculture is a segment of a larger culture whose members share distinguishing values and patterns of behavior. So, when people are, and I like this kind of little graph at the bottom, when people are individuals, and they identify with the subculture, it produces unique market behaviors, right? So if you're an individual, and you, again, with a subculture, you identify with your core culture and you identify with your subculture, right? You take on your core culture's values and norms. You also tend to take on the values and norms of your subculture. You demonstrate, or yeah, you demonstrate mass market behaviors that align with your core culture, right? Your overarching culture, and unique market behaviors that are attributed to your subculture. So there are a lot of ways that we can segment subcultures. So we could do it by ethnicity and race. We can do it by age. We can do it by sexuality. There are different subcultures that exist, right? So let's say if we were doing it by sexuality, and a person in the U.S., we would say that a person in the U.S. who is a homosexual, for example, identifies with the core culture of the United States as well as with their subculture, which is kind of maybe more with their sexuality subculture. I'll say that, and so on. So when we look at ethnic subcultures, this graph is from 2005 to 2020, and we can look and see how subcultures are growing. African American subculture will grow to be almost 14% of the nation, the United States. Hispanic or Latinx, about 17%. Asian, Pacific Islanders, 6%. Native Americans, 1%. So one takeaway from this chart is that a lot of ethnicities, their population as a proportion of the United States are growing, and so that's something to keep note of. So for Hispanic or Latinx Americans, you see a extensive use of Spanish language in communication. They have even smaller subcultures: Mexican American, Puerto Ricans, Cubans, Latin Americans. Low or limited levels of acculturation, meaning that not all Hispanic or Latinx consumers fully embrace everything about the core culture of the United States. They maintain some cultural influences from their home countries. And more than 60% of them have strong Hispanic identification or Latinx identification. What research has shown us about consumers who fall under this ethnicity is that they tend to have a positive attitude towards the government. They tend to be extremely brand loyal, which is really important if you're a marketer. You really want to go after the Hispanic market. They're brand loyal, and they really like prestige products, products that show that they have maintained or they're obtaining a certain level of prestige. Um, when you look at African Americans, they are roughly 14% of the population. They tend to be concentrated in the South. This makes sense if you think about the history behind African Americans and how African Americans got to the United States. They tend to be younger than the average American. Also important for marketers, right? So if you're targeting African American groups, know that they tend to be younger than the average African American. Just like Hispanic consumers, they tend to have a strong African American identification. So research has shown over and over that African Americans prefer African American ads, African American TV shows, so on and so forth. So if you want to get African Americans to like your product, put African Americans in your commercials, put African Americans in your television show, so on and so forth. Research has shown that African Americans have four major kind of consumer groups. 37% of them are contented. 24% are upwardly mobile, 21% tend to be living for the moment, and 18% tend to be living for the day. I have to look at this research again because I can't for the life of me right now remember what the difference is between living for the moment and living for the day. Um, Both sound pretty similar. Okay, so I talked about this idea of Hispanics being more favorable to government or having more positive attitudes towards the government, liking prestige goods, being more brand loyal. When we look at African Americans, there are some things that also stand out. One thing that stands out is that young African Americans use Twitter a lot. And I'll tell you a little anecdote about this. This is kind of funny. So I have a mentor. She is a full professor at UCLA. Brilliant woman, like brilliant woman. Every time I go down to California to work with her, I'm blown away by how intelligent she is. Anyway, we were at a conference, and this is kind of funny. We were at a conference and we were sharing a room, and she comes in the room one afternoon, and she's just like really upset about this panel that she went to where people were speaking, and I'm like, well, what's wrong? And she said, these people were so stupid. Right? This was her response. These people were so stupid. um and then she started talking about how some people were saying that there's this thing called Black Twitter for Black people, yada, 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 and how it didn't exist. And I had to tell her that actually is a thing, right? So there's this kind of subgroup. I don't know if you're aware of this. If you aren't, then now you know, called Black Twitter, with internet users who are Black who use Twitter. And if you look at the statistics by Pew Research, about 40% of young African Americans between the ages of 18 and 29 use Twitter versus their white counterparts. And honestly, when you look at all internet users, the difference between whites and blacks, 22% versus 16%. So young African Americans use Twitter quite a bit, and they do it to talk about society, to talk about themselves, whatever. Another thing that tends to be true of Black consumers is that Black consumer power is growing. So when you look at these numbers of kind of who is improving their income and consumer power, what you see is when you look at Blacks who have an income of more than $200,000, a household income, I should say, it's growing at a rate of about 156% versus whites, which is growing at 74%, meaning the number of people, or the percentage of people, is increasing quite a bit. When you look at 150 to 200,000, also you see this quite large gap. I'll bring one more thing that's really interesting for marketers and things we have to think about. Blacks with household incomes over 100K really like to shop online for movie tickets, right? 27% more likely, 27 or 17% more likely to shop for groceries, 12% more likely to shop for wine, which frankly, what? Who's shopping for wine online? Apparently these people, I don't know, it's weird. And then you can look at the rest in terms of social networks. So Asian Americans are the fastest growing subculture, and I say that, and I want to emphasize that because some people assume that it is Hispanic or Latinx Americans. They have the highest average income of any ethnic group. What's really interesting about that is that does mean that if you're a marketer, you should be super interested in these people, because they have disposable income. They have money to spend. Um, they tend to be more conservative. They also tend to be clustered in limited geographical areas. So 50% of Asian Americans live in California, New York, and Hawaii. That's it. 50%. You think about the entire country, 50% of them are in 3 states. They have the highest penetration of computers and internet, which again means that these are consumers that you want to go after. When you think about how they spend their money, Look at this. They spend more on adult beverages. They spend more on household goods. They spend more on health and beauty aids. And they spend more on over-the-counter medications. Now, I don't begin to understand the over-the-counter medications, but I will say that when you look at the difference in spending between Asian Americans and the average American consumer, they spend significantly more on health and beauty aids. That means to me that these are people you absolutely should be targeting. Asian Americans are extremely important consumers, and we need to be focused on them. One thing that tends to be true is that white Americans tend to be more pessimistic than other groups. When you ask consumers questions like, how do you feel about America's current course? A lot of white Americans will say that America is on the wrong track. When you look at other groups, though, those numbers substantially fall. So 73% of white Americans say it's on the wrong track. 37% of African Americans, 52% of Latino and Hispanic Americans, 40% of Asians. When you ask where are America's best days, the majority of white Americans say that those days are over, whereas only 20% of African Americans, 37% of Latino Hispanics, and 25% of Asian Americans. It's really interesting to think about this idea that, according to this survey, really the most optimistic group is African Americans. You could argue that the second most optimistic group here appears to be Asian Americans. I'll move to the next slide and then I'll talk a little bit more about this. So we see this also in this same different slide when the Atlantic did a survey and they asked, if the American dream is alive and well versus the American dream is suffering. You see that 40% of African Americans said the dream is alive and well. Almost 40% of Hispanics and more than 40% of Asians. Almost, I would say, probably about 47% of Asians. Whereas slightly less than 20% of white Americans say this is true. This is problematic. This is problematic, I would say, for us as a nation in general. But we can see it playing out in consumer behavior. So it's problematic because one, we can assume that these kind of thoughts have effects on people's psyche, right? So from a America, a nation standpoint, we don't want people to assume that the American dream is gone and that they have no hope of getting it, so on and so forth, because that kind of attitude will bring about negative consequences, right? And we see those negative consequences. One of the things that keeps happening is for the last, I would say, 2 years or so, maybe a little longer, we've seen articles published that middle-aged white Americans are having issues, and specifically, more importantly, the lifespan of white Americans is decreasing. It's not a substantial decrease. I think it's something like zero point 0.1 each year that they've measured it for the last couple of years. But any decrease is something to be noted, right? So, the average life expectancy might be 83, and now it's 82, so on and so forth. And then when they look deeper into the statistic, they start talking about why that is. And part of it is an increase in suicides. You will see people talk about suicides. I think we don't talk about it enough. One thing that tends to be true is that men, for example, and I think white men in particular, have higher suicide rates. And essentially, when you look at the real numbers of this, the reason is that men are more effective at actually killing themselves. Women actually try more often than men. So women, not that this is a race and they're winners, I don't want to assume that or give you that impression. Women are more likely to attempt suicide. Men are more likely to do it and actually kill themselves. Research into why this is true is that men choose more effective methods. So women might try to take a bunch of pills or slit their wrist, but people find them, they get to the hospital, they recover. Men are more likely to do things that are more dramatic, like actually put a gun to their head So this is somewhat problematic. Anyway, white Americans are doing more things like suicides. You see more drug use, so on and so forth. These things are affecting us, uh, the health. Okay, so I'm going to talk about two other subcultures, and I apologize up front. We don't have enough research on these groups. So, Asian Indians, people mostly from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh, so on and so forth, tend to be well educated. They tend to emphasize children. They are financially conservative and are really interested in value for the money, and they tend to be very male oriented. They have a husband dominated family decisions. In terms of Arab Americans from a variety of countries, there are some common heritage and language between them. They tend to be better educated and they tend to have high incomes. I apologize. I wish there was more to say about these groups, but there isn't a lot of research. I will tell you that there isn't a lot of research in general on African Americans or Hispanics or any of these other subcultures, but there's more for Asian Americans, Hispanics, and African Americans in these other groups. One reason is that one, the field does not publish a lot of research centered on diverse consumers. And then two, and this is really important, a lot of times when you see research on certain specific cultures, it's because people, members of those cultures, do research on those cultures. And so, as marketers, one thing I would tell you is that if you happen to be in a subculture that does not get a lot of attention, this is your opportunity, right? You can position yourself as a person who wants to do research on these groups. And if you live in a place like Detroit, that's going to be a big deal, right? We know that there's a pretty big Arab population here. I believe that to be true. Please correct me if I'm wrong. And kind of knowing the likes and the needs of these consumers is so important. I would say it's important in general, especially in a place like Detroit. And I think that would mean that you'd have people would be interested in you.